Hoài phai giang gan ra bị lương ngạc Ang con đi khát á tam Hoa ba thiên xuân đi in vai hồn Nhạc na tên la đều mang Hoài gầm loang lê gầm hôi y khôn đi đánh chàng Hoài lùi gà giang đi hẹn sinh sanh na Một sĩ lê bê làm rộng ra xa in đến chàng in Giê-xu tô y ôm son tung đi Chính chàng hoài nguồn quang cả tung cha Cùng toàn hoa gió Chàng đã phá dịp cả mưu địa Ang sơn cho huynh Quay ngầm nam dễ ngầm hôi y khổ linh Quay lùi ta giam thiên đen sinh sanh ta Một sinh sanh về làm rộng ra xa in đến cha mình Giê-xu tô y ôm son tung đi
Talk about.
Good. Na panha kasilai di kagien na khana pi takina hon sudwai khaya kagien khalung lut wala tele chagina.
Let's continue our study in the book of Hebrews, brothers.
Una te Hebrew iban sanon dinga.
I intend to get to the questions that are no longer on the board because you do not have a board.
Deya wai boda ki gel ken kha wai kha ana khai mang ta na hin awa ka.
But I wrote them here,
Ele hai ngun na ka gel ke.
so I'm not off the hook on that.
Ka kamang gel lo ka he.
But I want to talk about chapter 3 and 4 of Hebrews, which we skipped in my zeal to get to the end of chapter 4.
Wai bung ni la bung thum na kha. I wai kha ikien khang nai lok te kha kong gen pe lai dinga.
So what we've talked about so far in the book of Hebrews is chapter 1, He is God, and that's the foundation for everything else in this book.
Hel ai bung bia ki bul bi kingak na kha bung khat na pathian. Ai Jesu kha pathian hi na.
And the way chapter 1 starts reminds us that we are in the last days,
Bung khat na kha ai te hun na nung pen om hi ta jon hi la.
and that the message that has come to us is by His Son. It's a very special messenger.
Wai thu pen kha atapa tung to na hong pai hi chi kha ge nei.
And then we spent a good amount of time yesterday talking about chapter 2 and what He has done for us.
Wai bung ni na kha aman kha ai te de bang hong hi sakyam chi kha cham tha kin gen ta hi.
And what He's done has rendered Him a merciful and faithful high priest. He has changed for us so that God doesn't have to change to save us.
Aman kha ai adi kina siam kulian hi na to. Aman kha ai adi kina na thu pi ta. Hong sep sa ka wai kha pathian na de alo thelo hin na pi. Hilo hin na pi na e honi ja ka wai tin mu na hong o ma hi.
His deity and His character never changed, but He experienced new things for us.
Apathian na le a hi na pen a ke ke tuan lo na pi na adin mun hong khek chi thuai.
Which allows Him to be both merciful and faithful,
Kuche na e dia dikina he pi tu he hong he pi thi. He pi tu za ngai na di ma hi thi na dingina.
to be both our justifier and just at the same time,
Dik tak na le hon dik tak sak tuai thi na dingina.
to remain truthful and righteous and still give mercy.
Ama kha dik tak takana sem hi kom komena a he pi na lak the na dingina.
And so, Brother Russ talked about Satan today. Remember our discussion that Satan thought he had God caught in a trap between his character.
Na para sina sa tung ta hong gen ba bangina. Sa tagen kha pathian ama a hi na ni te kala kha. Boy sak udda na he, so boy udda na he.
And to sum up those first two chapters, Satan was wrong. God is able to keep His character and save us.
Himale tua Israelite le ki panina setan kha bol le lahi pathian kha ahi na ni te kha suboi to lawina honi the hi
And all of that brings us to chapter 3.
hoi de na kha bungthum na pan pi ta hi
Chapter 3 starts by reminding us of who he is.
bungthum na kha kwa hiam chiong hil chen masa a
Consider the apostle and high priest of our confession, even Jesus.
ya solta mon hoi tak le isiam pulian pen Jesu jinong dia hi
When he tells you that Jesus is an apostle or ambassador, he's referring to chapter 1.
he Jesu Christ pen kha solta dana kha gen saktu da nong gen chana kha bungkhat na thu tung to na ong gen hi
Chapter 1, verse 2, he has spoken to us in his Son. An apostle is an ambassador, a messenger who is sent.
che chang ni na kha bungkhat chang ni na kha aman tu hun na thu again ta ya chi na kha Jesu pen sola ambassador pe hi chi ka thi ngai
And he calls him our high priest, which was the point of chapter 2 and got us to verses 17 and 18.
hoi ba na siam pulian pen hong chi no na na 80 hon gen sak tu hi na ong gen chiang hi
So in the first verse of chapter 3, he's saying, remember chapter 1, remember chapter 2. Those things work together.
hoi ja ka bungthum na hong pat nai na hoi bungkhat na le bung ni na ana thei chen pha kun Jesu sol ta ka hi na le siam pulian hi na chi ong gen ta ka hi
Now in verses 2 through 6, we're going to start thinking about some other things that were always on the Jewish mind.
chang ni na le chang guk na kha jara de lung ta nga aom gi ge khat kha hong ta lang ding hi
He says, Jesus was faithful to him who appointed him, as was Moses in all his house.
aman kha mosi kha in kwan te la ka mon hoi bang na Jesu kha muan wa hi chi ong pa hi
Jesus was faithful while he lived on this earth in chapter 2 to the Father who sent him, chapter 1, verse 2.
he bung ni na kha Jesu kha apa tunga ginom ma ma hi dan kha hong la ka hi
Moses, when he was here as the mediator of the first covenant, was faithful to God also.
hotima bangena mosi le kha thu khun lui hun la ya kha pathiana dia ginom ma hi
And he dwelt among people who were not faithful,
mi ginom lo te la kina au ma
but Moses was faithful, and the phrase is, in all his house. In God's house, Moses was faithful.
ile pathian kwan pi ting tenga mosi kha ginom ve ve hi
Verse 3.
chang thum na
He, that is Jesus, has been counted worthy of much more glory than Moses, by as much as he that built the house has more honor than the house.
in sunga pa pen kwan teng sanga pa koin zong ding pun mosi sanga thupi zok sem na dia kilom asi ai chi ka mosi sanga Jesu thupi zoi na ong ge nei
Now, what is the house he's talking about?
he in kwan chi khap ko bang ge na hele
Go back in your minds to 2 Samuel chapter 7.
second Samuel bung sagi na em thak le hang
We don't often do that when we think of these passages.
he Hebrew sim cha na Samuel khai ngai to khan hi ki hi
But I want you to think of the promise in 2 Samuel chapter 7 verse 14 when you read Hebrews 3 verse 3 through verse 6.
second Samuel bung sagi chang som le na kha ingai to ma sak je ding hi
This promise in 2 Samuel is always in the Jewish mind.
he second Samuel bung som le na thu kha jura te lung ta nga mang thei lo hi
We should all know this promise.
he thu chiam khai mang hil ke ding a
The context here is David had said, I want to build a permanent house, a temple for Jehovah.
he ka David na pathena ding ina in kalam ding chi akicham na hiya
And Jehovah tells him, starting in verse 11, no, that's not the way this is going to work.
he le Jehovah pathena na huchibang hilo ding a hi achi
He says, I'm going to build you a house.
aman kha pathen kha nanga de in ong bol sak ding khai achi so da hi
And he says, you will have a son,
nang ta na nei ding a
and he's going to build me that house that you're talking about, the physical one.
aman kha kya dia in hongbol sak dinga hi
And in verse 13, he says, He shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever.
chang som thum na kha in kongbol sak dinga wai win pen tang ton om din dinga hi achi
In verse 14, he says, I will be his father, and he will be my son.
chang som leli na kha nang ama katapai dinga ke kha fa ka hi ding achi
Now, you all know this promise, right?
hai thu cham pen i theu ya
This is a prophecy with dual fulfillment, right?
hiai kha Jonathan kha atang tun na hi lung lut ma mau kha
This promise that David would have a son, and the son would build him a house, has two fulfillments.
David na tapa na idinga atapa ni inbo sak ding hi chi kha atang tun na ni ve thil ni na tang tun na hi thil ni na
Who is the first fulfillment?
atang tun na khat na ka ile
Solomon.
so
Yes.
mo ai
What is the first house?
ai in masa ka bang yale
It's the temple.
Solomon temple la hi mo
But notice it is not just the temple in the promise.
ile he thu chiam la ka wai temple kya gen kha ila wai
He's building a kingdom.
aman kha kumbigam bol heading
And we will refer, and scripture will refer to the house of David,
hoi la sing thawina David in chi bangina gen om sak dinga
the house of Israel.
Israel e in chi bagina
That means the kingdom of David,
hoi chu David lalgam gen naina
the kingdom of Israel.
Israel lalgam
So we have a first fulfillment in Solomon and the temple and Solomon's kingdom.
hoi jaka tan tum khat na chu hoi Solomon tung ton na ai lam na le Israel ke de lalgam phu khyak naina tan tung masa hi
But what is the ultimate fulfillment?
ai ha na kha ani na pen kha tan tung tak tak na kha bang hiam mi chi le
And I know you know this,
na the pin ka
so don't be afraid to say it. Remember, I like it when you talk to me.
kha kha gen khyak kha su keu lam the ka hi
Who is the ultimate fulfillment first? Jesus is the Son.
Jesu kha pathia ta hiya David ta hiya
And the ultimate fulfillment of the house is what?
hoya in lam ding a chi pen kha bang a ya le
It is the church,
na kha sap to ngai
which is the temple we are being built up a spiritual house.
hoi kha e te tung to na lam khyak in pen hiya
It is his kingdom
hoi chu ama lal gam le hi
with subjects who are members of the church
hoi kha ami te be kha sap to mi te hiwa
who have agreed to fall before him as king.
ama kumbi maya abok khup akun te hi
Now, I want you to think about that when you think about this introduction to chapter 3.
hoi je ka he bung thum na he ro bung thum na sim che ge na wai te ilung simai ko imasak ding ai
Because he says Moses was faithful in God's house back then.
a je kha hoi hun lai mo si kha pa khin kwan te a din amon hoi hi chia
Moses was faithful among those people, but Jesus is better.
mo si hoi hun lai na ain kwan bi gi nam ma ama le le Jesu kha muan hoi zo lai hi a chi hi
Verse 3, Jesus has been counted worthy of more glory than Moses because he built the house.
bang je ka Jesu kha pa toi tuak zo hiam an chi le Jesu in kha in tak tak pen lama hi a chi na hi
What did Jesus build?
Jesu alam khya ka bang ya le
The kingdom,
lal ga ma hi
the church,
sap duang
us.
ei te
Verse 4, every house is built by someone,
changli na in kwan chi pen ko hiam khat na lam khyak a hiya
not just the physical temple,
hoya mu the temple pen gen hi lawina
but the kingdom of God.
pathian lal gam pen gen hi
And it refers to him there as the builder of it. Do you see that?
hoi lam tu pen kha chi hai alam tu pen
Verse 3 says that he's entitled to glory because he built the house.
a je ka chang thum na kha hoi in lam tu a hi zia ka kha ma kha pa toi sem tang tuak a chi again ei
Verse 4, who built the house? The builder of this is who?
changli na kha alam tu pen ko hi dile
Is God.
pathian hi
We have another reference back to chapter 1. Jesus is
ไว้ปัทยานอาจิเป็นค่ะบุงขัดนาเยซูกิเอ็นเป็นให้
Verse 5, Moses indeed was faithful in all his house as a servant for the testimony of the things which afterwards are to be spoken. But verse 6, but Christ as a son over his house, whose house we are if we endure.
เฮ็ดจังมาจังบุงไหนจินเกนะวันไว้ลงมาทุกเย็นหลายดิ้งเตะทิ้งสักนาดินโมซีปัทยาลิงกวนเต็งละกะนาเซมปาอินโซมวนหอยเงฮีคริสเบลปัทยาลิงกวนตุงะตะปายนามวนหอยอตบตะนากิงักไหนละเม็ดนาอีกปาปีอีวงหอยพดเลยเอียดิ้งไงอินกวนปีเตฮิวฮี
And you see how when he is referring in verse 6 to Jesus as a son, and he's referring to this house, he's tying it all back in to the son-king promise of 2 Samuel chapter 7.
พอจะเฮ็ดจังบุกนาคา 2 Samuel chapter 12ฝากกินเปลี่ยนครับหมอเฮียตั้งตุนนาคาเยซูคาตาอินของปังอาอินลำตุยของปังฮีจิค่ะตั้งตุนนาเกียนเจียงมาตาเฮ
Now remember, this book is written to people who come out of Judaism.
ใช่เฮบรูหลายค่ะจุดไดซิมาคิดว่าเนี่ยนะของปอดเฮเดไปเบกราวน์นี่เดียว
They absolutely are going to be thinking of this promise of the eternal king from 2 Samuel chapter 7 when they hear a son and building a house.
พอยค่ะอามาเต้นค่ะไว้จุดเต้นค่ะใช้ 2 Samuel เย็นเป็นค่ะตั้งตุนนาเป็นตั้งต้นเรากำอีดิ้งให้ดังค่ะที่เจียนเดียวเฮ
So this is very important to the Jewish mind when they hear this.
พอยจุดเต้นลุงรุ่นนับเป็นให้นาขยายเป็นอาซับเจ้าหัวหน้าที่เสียมใบดีวะ
This is what they were looking for.
เฮคามาเอาละเม็ดเป็นอันนี้กี่เดีย
They understood the ultimate kingdom and the ultimate king was forecast by that promise.
อามาว่าเดี๋ยวละเม็ดเป็นอุค่ะคุมพี่ห้อยเป็นอะไรกับห้อยเป็นที่ละเม็ดกี่เดียนาวะ
And I think we as non-Jewish people sometimes miss how important this would have read in the Jewish mind.
ไอ้เจ้าค่ะห้อยตะไคร้ที่จะโลเสียกันนะจุดเต้นไงปอยหมดทุกว่าค่ะไงปอยหมดโลเลยที่เสียมโลวินัยมันคัสเกะ
And I don't want you to miss this because what he's doing in verse 6 is just screaming at them.
อาจจะขยายจังกุกนาเกียนเป็นค่ะอามาวาเดียค่ะไงนกหวยมาอามาวาเดียไงทุบพี่หวยมาอามาเกียนเฮจีเทปยังไงเทปปียังไง
He's saying that son you have always been looking for, that house you've always been looking for, that kingdom you've always been looking for, that's Jesus.
หวยตาป้านั่นละเม็ดกีเกเป็นหวยอินลำดิ้งนั่นละเม็ดเป็นหวยเราดำห้องติดดิ้งจีนั่นละเม็ดเป็นหวยเยซูฮีอาจินาเฮ
You've been looking for it for so long, and that is what Jesus has given us. You get to be that in that kingdom, in that house, if
หวยนั่นละเม็ดเป็นหวยอินสุงานมาอมเทคนาดีมุนะ
if, he says, we are there, we are in the house, if we hold fast our boldness and the glorying of hope until the end.
หวยอินกวนมีในเทนาดีมุนะกิบตะกาอีวมหอยดิ้งกิบตะกาอีกินตาอีวมหอยดิ้งจิค่ะทุบเยฮี
If you understand the Jewish mind, you will understand how important that is. This is the thesis statement of chapter 3.
ยาข้าพุงธมาดิ้งนะอะไรยิลปีเป็นค่ะเฮ
Everything the Jewish nation has been looking for is here.
จุดน้ำพุ่งปีนะอะไรเม็ดเป็นค่ะเฮนะการป้อมไปค่ะเฮ
We've already discussed that the message of this book is don't try to go back to Judaism.
เฮียเฮบรูไลครับถึงตุเป็นจูจุดไอซิมากิกนนกิ้วจุดสักว่ากิกนนกิ้วทุกมีสักว่ากิกนนกิ้วนั่นสินะจู
And what he's saying in verse 6 is you have obtained what was promised.
อาจจะข้าจำพวกนายนะหวยทุเจียมเป็นขมุตานะฮิว
All you have to do is hold on to it.
หวยโนละมาฮิดิอมซุนจูหวยเป็นเลนกิบตาว
At the end of our discussion yesterday, we talked about Exodus chapter 14, verses 13 and 14.
อาจารย์ชดาบุงสมนลิจังสมนทุมสมนลิทุยเย็นตา
God had given them salvation from Pharaoh.
ปะเทนฟาโรห์เก็บปันสวดตักนาเปตา
He'd said, you watch, I'm doing the work, now just walk. You remember that discussion?
นกเต็นเอ็นเลนุนลาดิงกิปุนลาเอ็นุนลาเก่งค่ะ ana sem ding kahi no na pai pan pai lalun
That's what he's saying in verse 6.
ko he changuk na gen pen kha omdan kha
Jesus built that house. You're in the kingdom. Salvation is yours.
Jesun kha in alam ta a ko in sunga om na hiwa hodam na kha Jesu om hi
Now, why are you standing there? Just walk.
hoi pan kha om mai no lo na pai taun a chi nai
So the end of that verse is very important. Hold fast to our boldness with hope until the end.
ding ki pina hang san takina len ki pun la kinomun a chi nai
So we're going to flesh out the rest of this chapter with that in mind. Don't lose that concept.
wai ngai tu na pen khamang ne het lo ina ban sim ding he
So verse 7, he starts quoting from the Old Testament.
tang sakit na le kun ya pa na la khia ka hinona
And he cites Psalm 95.
sam som ko le nga ke pan la khia ka he
He says, therefore, even as the Holy Spirit says, today, if you hear his voice.
ko jen kha siang thawina tunin aw na za ku le
Now, over the next page or so of your scripture, he's going to say today a whole lot.
abana isim to jen kha tuni chi kha ki gen mun ma ta dinga he
And then at the end of this chapter, he's going to talk about tomorrow.
het chang to na khai le jing lam thu hong gen ta dinga he a jing non thung gen pan dinga he
But here's the message. We are in today.
hi le ha poi mo pen chu e te kha tuni huna om he
And the message that he's about to unfold here is the Jews wanted to stop right when they crossed over the Red Sea.
he the de kha zurak te kha wai tui pi san akan hitwa kha mau kha pa tol dang mutta hi mo da ne
Had they gotten to the point of rest yet?
ai le hoi mun kha tol dam na mun di hi tak tak ta ya
They still had to walk.
apa yu ngai lai chu mo
They literally stood between salvation and the promised land.
amau te kha hot dam na le wai gam cham pen kala ding chu hi ta hiu
And his message to these people in chapter 3 is you stand between salvation that has been built and the promised land.
hoi te he chang bung thum nine again pen le kha no te pen kha hot dam na le wai gam cham gam kala om na hi tau wai ding na hi tau a chi na he
So he says, today if you hear his voice, harden not your hearts in the day of provocation.
hoi ja tu nia ana o na za ko le kha na lung tang khau sak non keun che
Like in the day of trial in the wilderness where your fathers tried me by proving me and saw my works for 40 years.
hoi lai na pila pu te un hon je tina hon khem wa kum som li sanga kum som li sunga kathili te amu hi wai dan en om keun
How long was their journey between salvation and the promised land?
hot dam na le gam cham kal kumang za lu ta le
A generation.
khang khat ma mai
The promised land had already been prepared.
hoi a gam cham pe na ma de bol khok sa hi
Verse 10, he says, I was displeased with this generation and said, they do always err in their heart. They did not know my ways.
chang som na hu chin hoi son te tunga leng kalung hita ke hi alung tangun ngai tu hial gi gewa kalampi te leng a thei keu a chi hi
When the psalmist says they did not know his ways, does that not strike you as odd?
heya samina sam gel tu na khamo alampi te wa thei keu chi kha wa khan lung tangong vit khaya
What had this group of people that come out of Egypt seen?
heya ai gupta ga ma ke pan tat khia ka om ten kha bang chi banga thil mu hi mai zen wa
They'd seen all of the plagues.
amau ten kha go na teng amu wa
They'd seen the victory over who was considered the God of this world.
leitung pathian dan amin angai to tu ku hoi faros te pa te tung agol tung tuan nau le theiwa amuwa
They watched the sea part.
hoi tu pi san pen khas hong satan om chi amuwa
They will be standing at the bottom of Mount Sinai seeing the thunders and the lightning.
amau khasinai tangbula dingena hoi kol phezwa zwa kon pakhian thupi na thupi ta kha amuwa
and so afraid that they said, "Don't let God speak to us anymore. You speak to us, Moses, because we're afraid we'll die if we hear him."
pakhian hi na thei chen ma mai na pakhian pau sak non ken nang pau zo tain kamungam non keu cha pakhian thupi na alo hoi na mu khin sa te wi
And you know, God will say, they said well when they said that. They should fear me always.
ke hon lok gi gi di hi chi
But the psalmist says they didn't know his ways.
hi ne ha sam gel tun kha kalampi te the keu chlai lai he
Because for all of the glory and all of the majesty and all of the might and all of the power, they hadn't really recognized who he was.
pakhian thupi na teng teng athili thina teng teng kha thei chen tak tak lo hi da na hi wa mau teng kha
And why is that?
bang se ka hi di
It's because they didn't trust him.
pakhian amuan de bangwa amuan tak tak lo zia pa he
So when we look at verse 8, where it speaks of them hardening their hearts in the day of provocation,
he chang get na kha ze ta om lai alung tang kha sak ki chi he
turn over to Exodus chapter 17, and I want you to see what the day of provocation was.
Exodus som le sagi na kha alung tang kha sak hun lai kha bang thu hi bang thu na hi chen dinga
In Numbers, he will say, "They tempted me 10 times."
number sa kha som nei ta khon je tu achia
But Exodus 17 is one of the first of those express temptations.
hoi bung he ya Exodus bung som le sagi na kha hu che banga je na ane ma sak lai hi ya
So in Exodus 17, verse 2, they are complaining because they don't have enough water.
he bung som le sagi chang ni na kha tui don ding tung tanga phun na wi ya
And Moses says unto them, "Why do you strive with me? Why do you tempt Jehovah?"
hoi mo si don na chu bang je ka hon kinak pi na hiwa bang je ka to pa je na hiwa
And this is the episode where Moses will be told to strike the rock.
he hun lai ta ka he mo si kha suang sat dinga
And he will do that.
hoi kha hi a
And in verse 7, we read, "And he called the name of the place Massa and Meribah because of the striving of the children of Israel."
in huchi na hoi mun min kha masale meraba asawa Israel son ten to pa tonga ila ko to pa om hia om lo achi sia ko na
Now, if you need to prove to yourself that this is exactly the time that he is talking about in Hebrews chapter 3, turn over to Psalm 95. It uses those words.
hoi je ka he ro bung thum na sam som ko le nga na thu he ya hong gel son pen kha he ya Exodus bung som le ko na thu a hi chi thei ngai
Psalm 95 that the Hebrew writer quotes is talking about Massa and Meribah.
hoi je ka Hebrew bung thum nine kha masale meraba thu tan chen ge na hi chi thei ding
It's talking about this episode right here in Exodus chapter 17.
Exodus som le sagi na thu gen ge na hi chi thei ding
And we read in Hebrews chapter 3 that they made trial of him in the wilderness in this day of provocation.
hoi je ka he chang pon na kha hu che ba ge na pathian
So
Tam
look,
bei PSA tu chi again he.
so look at verse 7 of Exodus 17 and see what the trial was that they put to Jehovah.
Exodus som le sagi Exodus
Back in 17, the same one.
ตามสวิต
Exodus
som le sagi
17,
na
7.
chang sagi na bang gen na le.
He'll say, because they tempted Jehovah, saying, "Is Jehovah among us or not?"
To pa to wa ila kwa to pa om ya om lo a chiu he.
They don't trust him.
Pathian muang tak tak lo hi do chung.
The trial is not just that they said, "We want water."
He ya pathian aze na menu kha kadang ta ku chi le na hi lo na.
The trial is that they're thinking, "Have you taken us out of Egypt just to let us die because God's not even among us?"
Ai hoi mau gen kha asiding le la kha hong pi hian na hiam ila ko pathian om tak tak na hiam chi na pathian gi ngel lai wi.
Because in this period between salvation and the promised land, they don't trust that he's with them.
Aje ka he hot don na le gam chiam tun ma ka la kha pathian amon de bang muang tak tak lo hi chi na ai.
Brothers, as I'm talking about them, don't forget that we stand between salvation and the promised land.
Hoi te gen che unau te ei te le hot dam na le gam chiam kala omi hi chi imang hil lo ding he.
Don't forget that the people to whom the book of Hebrews is written stood between the kingdom being built and the promised land.
He Hebrew lai khak sim tu te le kha hot dam na le wai gam chiam kala ding hi chi I thei pi ding he.
Don't forget that God came and walked among them and among us. Hebrews chapter 2.
Hebrew bung ni na kha ama tu hong pa ya ilakina hong ma hi chi le mang hil lo ding he.
And at the end of Matthew, he'll say, Lo, I'm with you always, even until the end of the earth.
Ma thai bung top na kha ngai un khovel top phai na nakyang kom ding chi hon cham kin he.
Because between salvation being accomplished and the promised land, we still have to trust and we still have to walk.
Azeng hot dam na bu kim kha sep suwa inom ta hi le kha wai gam chiam tum na dinga hi dingom lai hi.
And his message in chapter 3 is God was angry with them in that generation in the wilderness because they didn't trust.
Pa khian hoi hun lai a hoi khang te tunga kha pa khian a het na pen kha agin tak lo uzia ko ai ke le amuan zo lo uzia ko he.
So verse 11, he says this. He says, I swear in my wrath, they will not enter my rest.
Hoi pa khian thu gen kha bang hem che le hebro bung tum sang som li na ka thang pai na ka ke chiam bangin ka khol na alut ke dingu che he.
He's already saved them.
Pa khian na amao a hot khiak sai lo mo.
They are out of the clutches of Pharaoh. They are out of the clutches of the king of the world.
Ha faro ko apan swakta khovel kumpia ke panina swakta kin ayu hi.
Christians are out of the clutches of Satan. They are out of the clutches of the prince of darkness of this world.
Christian te ka satan hakola ke panina swakta khovel kumpi mial kumpia ke panina swakta te hiu hi.
But we still must walk with him.
Hilele e ama to iton ngai ve ve lai he.
And if we don't trust him, we say, I don't even know if he's among us. That is offensive to God.
Hile ama inguan zo lo wa pa khian ila ka om hiam om lo hiam ichi jan jan le pa khian tunga thang pai ma ma ding he.
Now look at verse 11 carefully because this is strong language.
Chang song le khat na pe ne kampao kha ma awa hi.
I swore in my wrath they will not enter into my rest.
Ka thang pai nan ka ke chiam hi ka khol na alut ke dingu.
He's already built the kingdom for them. He's already built the house.
Ama wading ina inalam kit saksa hiya alo da malap kit alam kit saksa hiya.
The rest has already been prepared for them. It's waiting for them.
Aktol dam na diu kama wading ina bol kho sai tai tol dam mun diu.
And he doesn't just say, I'm thinking about changing my mind.
Where ka pat ina kalung sim ka khek non hiam chilan lo ina.
He says, because you didn't trust me and you weren't willing to walk the rest of the way with me, I swear you will not enter it.
Pat khian again ke ka ba hiam chi le. No te kha ke to na ton ul lo zia ko na. Na lut ke hial diu ka ke chiam he chi mo ba he.
Now we're going to read about other sworn oaths by God in the book of Hebrews.
Kaya ka pat khian ke chiam na thumal dam te le aban le zalai di.
You can tell by my pace of how fast I move through lessons that we're not going to get there.
Yang una ten bang chu kina ke kino leng le hoi tan chu tung zo lo mai the he mo. Gen kham man lo mai the.
Brother Russ just nodded with a grimace.
Pak khian chu na pan he sama ma ta nei.
But when we get to chapter 6, we're going to hear how important an oath is.
Hele bungkung na yong sim check na apoi mo he kha I thei chen sem dinga.
The oath that was given to Abraham of the seed promise, how important was that?
Abraham ke nga thu chiam pa khian ke chiam na kha pang chu ka poi mo ya le hoi chi suan na chi kha.
The writer says he made the promise with an oath so that we would be doubly sure that what was going to happen, what he had said would come to pass.
Pa khian na a ke chiam na Abraham ke nga a ke chiam na pen kha mo. E te na tang tung tak te hi chi kha tang tung pen ma hi chi thei chen ding na pa khian ke chiam ana chi hial ai.
And we'll read about the oath that there would be a priest after the order of Melchizedek.
Melchizedek bang banga syampu hongom ding he chi le pa khian a ke chiam na a hi.
And by the way, the idea that Jesus is our king was also sworn with an oath.
เพราะว่าเยซูเป็นกุมปีหิดิงให้จิเลปัจเจียนกิจยมนาหิ
That's in Psalm 89.
ว่าข้าซ้ำสมเกียรติและกวนนากิเยน
So we have all of these great promises that are sworn with an oath.
ให้ทุเจียมเต็งข้ากิจยมนาโตทุเจียมเนี่ยนะ
That 2 Samuel chapter 7 promise of the king and the kingdom, that's with an oath.
หอย2 Samuel บุงสมเลยนะเลขาโมหอยเตขาทุเจียมกิจยมนาโตทุกุนเนี่ยนะ
That Jesus would also bring the high priesthood up to that throne is sworn with an oath.
เยซูคริสต์เลยหอยเสียมพหินาเป็นหอยเราตุพะตนาข้าหุ่นปีตุงเดียเจีย
And that all families of the world will be blessed through him is sworn with an oath.
พูดจีน่ะเลยตุงน้ำจีอันบากดิวจีเลยครับปัทยานี่นะกิจยมนาโตทุกุนนะ
But God is so offended at their lack of trust when they say, "Is God among us?" that he swears with an oath, you don't receive any of those.
พูดจะบังปัทยานี่นะกิจยมนาโตอัทุเจียมสาหินเลยครับเฮียดินายไบเบิลจังสินมาบังนะนอกินตาโลเจียกุนะกักิจเจียมาฮีนะไว้กำนัลุดเกเฮียดิวปัทยาจิมาไม่
Now again, remember why we're talking about this. Verse 6 told us what?
เฮียข้าบังเจียเฮียมิจิข้าบุงกุกนาจังกุกนาข้าหงเกียนเจียนดิงะ
You are in the kingdom. You are a member of his house if you hold fast and endure until the end.
โนเตข้าปัทยาอินสุงมีเตนปัทยาอินกวนมีเตนเฮียอัตโตปตนานนักกินหนาวนั่นแหละกิบคดพอตุเลยจะตาย
So the reason he is quoting from Psalm 95 here is because they were his people, but they did not endure till the end.
ไอ้ละบังจากซ้ำสมกว่าเลยงานะทุกขยะตุงตังะกิเกนขยะไม่จิเลข้าอามาอุเตข้าอัตโตปตนาข้าอากินอมโซโลอุเซียกว่าข้ามาไว้สินไหลลักนั่นดิ่งนะหงกิเกตทักไอ้
And therefore they don't get to enter into the rest.
ไอ้เจ้าข้าอามาอุเตข้าไว้อัตโตดำน้ำมุนดิวะข้าตุงโซโลไว้ตาวเฮ
And to foreshadow something we'll talk about before the end of this discussion, what is that rest? We've already said it.
ไว้โตดำนากิจิข้าบางแห่งจิข้าโอลาเฮลเชียนดิ่งเฮลโตดำนาจิเป็นข้าบางฮิดีเล่
Is that rest a Sabbath day?
ไว้โตดำนาจิข้าสบัดนีตันนีเฮียกิกินนีตันนีเป็นข้า
We could call it that, but it's not a weekly Sabbath day.
เฮเลไว้อาเกนเป็นข้านิพิกาลเตงะโคลนักสบัดนีเป็นเกนฮิโลไว้
That rest, we ought to capitalize every time we see it.
ไว้โคลนัก
It's
จิไว้
capital T, capital R, the rest.
ไว้โคลนักกิจิเป็นข้าอมเจงะข้าทุมัลเลียนนะข้ากิปันนักเฮไลมัลโกลากิปันนักเฮ
For them, it was the promised land.
อามาเอาเตียดิ่งนะไว้โคลนักจิจะเป็นอากำเจียมเป็นเกนเฮีย
For the Christians that the Hebrew writer is writing to, it's the capital P, capital L promised land.
ไว้กินตุติยาเดียเป็นเบลไว้ข้าปักยันพ่นกำเจียมโคลนาเป็นอะฮี
Did that translate? Could you do that?
I want to refer directly as eternal rest.
Call it that. Call it that.
ตัดต้นกำเย็นนะฮีอ๋อกำเจียมค่ะ
I know I make it hard for you, brother. I'm sorry. So verse 12, take heed, brethren, lest haply there shall any one of you have an evil heart of unbelief in falling away from the living God.
พอจะกระชังส้มนี่นะครับอุณาวเตียวปิลวาnguนหุจีลวินโซปัจเจหิงตบสันดิกินน่ารักกว่าเปลสุงะกินโลนาลุงตังกิโลหงคดิงฮีอาชี
You see, it's verse 6 all over again.
แค่ขัดจังกุ้งนาทุกขัดกิมุนอนไงตัวนอนเทจมอ
Don't fall away. That's his message.
ปุกมังกิอุนเจฮี
Keep walking. Exodus chapter 14, verse 13 and 14. Keep walking.
เอ็กซ์โดสบุงส้มนี่นะเกียนบางเงินะไปตะกินะไปซอมเซลุนเจฮี
Now, we are going to see this word today a whole lot.
แค่ทุมัลขัดคุณนี่นะจะตั้มมาดิงะ
Verse 13, but exhort one another day by day, so long as it is called today.
พระเจ้าจังส้มเลยทุ่มนะคะตูนี่อาจิอากิจิเทไลนะฮัสวันตัวเซมมุนเจ
And in my version, that is capitalized. The word today is capitalized.
เฮียกี่เวอร์ชันนะครับตูนี่กิจิค่ะ
Because
เป็น
my,
นักเก็ตอะไร
because my translators knew that it was an important word.
อาจจะใครcái Bible เลยเขียนตัวเต็มเขาไว้ครับทุกคนหมดตะกี้เจนนั่นเทเจนจากไว้
So what does he mean when he says today? What day is that?
ไอ้เนี่ยตัวนี้จิค่ะบางเกณฑ์น่ะหิดีเลย
Have you ever thought that question when you're reading this passage? How long are we supposed to exhort each other?
ไอ้เด็กบางตาไหนเลยเด็กหันถอนดิค่ะ
I mean, there's a command there. Exhort each other so long as it is called today.
ตัวนี้ก็จิตเหตุไรนะแค่ส่วนตัวเซมมุนจริงค่ะ
You get to stop when it's no longer called, quote unquote, today.
ตัวนี้ไอ้นอนเราเชียงอ่ะเบลแค่ส่วนไหนนอนเราเมื่อ
So if that's a command, when do you get to stop?
ไอ้เลยบางจิตเชียแค่ส่วนตอบดีเดียวเลยตัวนี้เบลเป็นตัวนี้ส่วน
When today is over. And my brother Russ says, tomorrow.
มันก็สิเชีย
Hey, guess what? He's right. And he's right. And I've written tomorrow later in chapter 4.
ผมลิขิตคำสั่งนะสิ่งจะถูกขัดแย้งกัน
So what does he mean? What is the time span of today?
คุณจีน่าขายตัวนี้เอชิคาบังตนาสาวะเฮียจีนดี
That's a good way to put it. Your lifetime.
อีดำสมเจียวนาปันค่ะ
Today is when the opportunity is here for us to walk.
ตัวนี้จีเป็นค่ะไว้คุณเล่มอิมุสุงเฮ
You can see it in verse 13 itself. Each day by day you exhort. Today is not one day, brethren.
สังสมนี่นะคะตัวนี้จีเป็นค่ะไอซิมดานนี่ขัดเลือดันที่เราได้จุ่มที่
Remember,
ส่วนตัวเซมมุนจีนะคะ
remember when this book is about? Chapter 1, verse 2?
มุงขัดจังนี่นะครับตัวนี้ในเจ๊เจ้าจีค่ะ
This book is about the last days.
ตัวนี้จีเป็นเฮียลายบูเป็นค่ะตัวนี้ตั้งเช่นนี้นะเฮ
You exhort one another day by day while we can still say the word today.
พายจากตัวนี้อีจีเทหุ่นลายเต็งค่ะตัวด้านนั้นเอกหันทองตัวจริงดีนะเฮ
How about turn over to 2 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 2.
Second Corinthians chapter 6.
2 Corinthians chapter 6.
2 Corinthians chapter 6 verse 2 and all.
And I tell you what, Paul knows scripture. 2 Corinthians chapter 6. Let's start in 1. Read 1 and 2.
ปัจเจียนเฮปีนาพัดตัวปีโลวานัตันโลนาดิมุนอามาเสปีโกเตนกะฮอนเงินเป็ดมาโอเฮหุ่นกิปะวายะกะฮอนไงเขียฮอดดำนันเนียคนปันปีอจิงาลาไงตูหุ่นกิปะวายะตูฮอดดำนันเนียฮี
What's the acceptable time?
ฟักเฮลินฮอนปมที่หุ่นข้าบังอะไรเล่
What is the day of salvation?
ฮอดดำนันเนียข้าบังหุ่นอะไรเล่
Now is the acceptable time. This is the day of salvation.
ตูนกิปะวายตูนฮอดดำนันเนียฮีจีฮี
Do you understand the point that he's making there?
เฮีย again เป็นเทตามอตูนี่จมดันค่ะ
And if you want to build that idea even further, turn over to Psalm 118. We won't do that right now.
สร้างสมละเอียดหนาเลยค่ะ
But you look at Psalm 118 and verse 24 and around there.
สร้างจาลสมละเอียดหนาว่าอามุดจากเทยิงอ่ะ
Okay, everybody's turning there, so I'll turn there.
แล้วไม่กว่าเพนในช่วยกันในของเพนนอนไม่ดี
That's a good idea. Anytime I mention a passage, you make me go there.
แต่สิมเราได้กันติดใจแล้วน้องเพนในเจ้าหมอก็กระซิมติดจริงไงสิไง
And look at verse 22 of Psalm 118. The stone which the builders rejected has become the head of the corner.
ซ้ำจาลสมละเอียดหนา
Verse, do read 22 and 23.
สมนี่เนี่ยสมนี่เนี่ยทงกงสิมดิงอินลำเตียนสวงได้โลอันนี้งาสวงพัดตัวเป็นอันนี้ตาฮีหอยตู้ปลาอาฮีอิมิดมัวอลัมดังอาฮี
Verses 22 and 23. What has he done?
สังสมนี่เลยสมนี่ทุมินาโตปันบังอาฮีสกาเล
This is Jehovah's doing. It is marvelous in our eyes. He made the stone of stumbling.
เฮค่ะเยซูอินะอธิลโบเตียฮี
And I don't know what my brother just said there, but he said Jesus, didn't you? Does it say it?
Yeah.
You say Jesus there?
Yeah. I had mentioned Jesus.
เอาปลาที่ไหน
โตปาฮีเจ้าว่าโตปาฮี
Does your Psalm 118 actually use the name Jesus? My brother gets ahead of me. But he's right. He has done a marvelous thing. He gave us Jesus, the stone of stumbling.
Aman kha wai Jesu kipalpuk na suang pen han pia hi che.
Chapter 2, what he's done. Chapter 2 of Hebrews, what he's done.
Aja kai bro bong ni na kha akhilit pen gen hi ya.
And then Psalm 118, verse 24 is on the heels of that. This is the day that Jehovah has made. Rejoice and be glad in it.
Aja ka he again pen kha tu ni hun kipa hot dam na ni hi kipa ko na chi pen kai.
So what is today according to Hebrews chapter 3?
Aja ka he bro bong thom na tu ni chi kha bang na ya le.
It is day by day, every day that you can say with your physical lips, today.
Aja ka tu ni chi pen kha hun teng ni tenga kha mo tu ni nakam namu ki na tu ni chi ti hun lai teng kha tu ni me.
It is for every man that time between salvation and the promised rest.
Pa kami teng tenga ding ina hot dam na le wai tol dam no wai tang ton tol dam na hun ki kal gen na
And
he.
what does that make the promised rest? That makes it tomorrow.
Aja ka hoya ya ding ina wai imu hun chu jing jang ni ta ding he mo tu ni lo chu jing na chi kha tang ton dam me.
And as we dive into the rest of this chapter, that makes that another day that Joshua will speak of.
Aja ka jo so han gen de kha hun dang ha chi pen kha mo aba na gen ding he hun dang ha chi pen ka tu ni chi ka hun dang pen ka.
So verse 13, exhort one another day by day, so long as it is called today, lest any of you be hardened by the deceitfulness of sin.
Aja chang som le thum nai na tu ni a chi lai na ki ha suan to sem me khet na khem ha ja ka hi khawa non lo na ding.
Our job between salvation and the promised land is to exhort one another and hold fast with boldness.
Aja ite ka hot dam na le hoi gam chiam itun ma ka la hi di pen kha kip ta ka len ki pa idin kip diu hi me.
And then look at verse 14 and see verse 6 again in it. For we are become partakers of Christ if we hold fast the beginning of our confidence firm to the end.
Bung thum chang som ni na khain thak no leng chang buk nam chang sem dinga ikingak na kipat na pen atop ta na kip ta ka ivom hoi phot le Chris at tan nei te hi tau hi.
And he repeats that language from Psalm 95 again. Right after this, he says, while it is called today.
Kuchina chang som le nga na pen kha sam som ko le nga na pan ke la son jel mo tu ni in awon na zak chegun a hel lai bangun na lung tang khau sak eun che he.
Now, we have this discussion that starts getting into chapter 4 here.
Ai hoi te na bung li na ang pi lu the ta a.
He says that they fall in the wilderness. Let's see how verse 17. He was displeased with them 40 years.
Chang som le sagi na kha kum som li alung amau tum alung hi ke chi ha.
Verse 18. Who did he swear would not enter into his rest or tomorrow or the promised land?
Kha chang som le get na kha ama khol na khol lo ding jing cha khol na mo lo ding a chi te kha ko te hi wa le.
It's those who are disobedient. Is that what your version says?
Yes.
It's those who are disobedient.
Tumang lo te ve le mo lu lo te kha.
Verse 19.
Chang som
And
le
we
na
see that they were not able to enter because of what? We see that they were not able to enter because of unbelief.
agin ta lo je ko na lu lo di chi kai the ha.
Don't miss the sermon that's in those two verses.
Ko ja som le gela som le ko na gen te hamang ke nyo le.
He swore that they would not enter the rest because of their disobedience,
Athuman lo na zia kuna wa gam che malut ke yal dingu.
but they weren't able to enter because of their unbelief.
Agin ta lo zia kwa lu the lo di le ke chi ai.
Because those two things are intimately tied in the way we conduct ourselves.
Aja kha igam tak da na hawai thuman lo na le gin ta lo na kha ki som ma ma ai.
And the Greek word that is translated belief it's the word pistis.
Greek pa wa kha hawai gin na ke chi kha gin ta na ke chi kha pisti sa ya.
We frequently translate it as faith.
Hoi pe en gin na chin le khia
It has a great deal to do with trust.
hoi gin na ke chi kha muan ngam na tok kinai ma ki gam ki sop ma mai
Just to keep this in the discussion, the context of the discussion we're having, if you trust that God is among you, you are not going to think He's going to let you die in the wilderness of thirst.
he pa thia na muan ngam na tak tak nei lo chin khaya gam da ya dam ta ka silo din heu
You are going to believe His promise that if you just walk, you will attain the promised land.
nan pai le le chin kha wa gam cham pen tung din hi chi kha ging ta din hi
And that belief, that trust, will make you obey.
hoi ja hoi gin ta na la muan ngam nai na athuang mang sak mei ding ai
Because of your trust.
na muan ngam na zia kina
So your obedience is simply a manifestation of your trust.
hoi ja ka athu na mang na pen kha na muan ngam na zia khong hi ding ai
Your lack of obedience is a manifestation of a lack of trust.
hoi na muan ngam lok level athu le zui ngam lo din ai
That's your sermon in verses 17 and 18.
hoi kha chang som le sagi na la som le gyat na kha sermon pi pe na hi
So as we get into chapter 4, we have learned what today is.
bungli na kha tu ni chi bang he chi khai kiet chang sem ding a
It's this entire period between salvation and the promised land.
tu nia period tu kha ya hot dam na le hoi gam chiam pen ki ka gi ge yo
So verse 1 of chapter 4, and let us therefore fear, lest there being a promise left of entering His rest, any one of you should seem to have come short of it.
hoi ja ka bungli na chang khan hoi ja ki lau ding ko chelo in zo khol na lu na thu chiam om lai na pi na na la ko pe ching lo in nom kha jan ding chi he
You can fall in the wilderness and not get to the promised land.
ei te kha hoi gam da ya kha pu ka
Verse-
chiam tung zo lo ding yom the he
Verse 2, the good news did not profit them because they did not hold fast with boldness to that promise.
he chang ni na kha thu ke pa hoi khat again ama akyang again a hi bagin tan chinoi ikyang wa gen a hingala chinang ke pa na he
And in verse 3, he says that rest was prepared before the foundation of the world.
e a ding ale hoi gam chiang mai na khamo chang thum na kha wai thoi thu cham pen kha khovel ki bon ma khovel le tung siam ma om khina hi chi ta hi
So now let's start talking about what tomorrow is.
ai la tu na jing chiang thu kha gen ta ding he
And some of us had a discussion yesterday or the day before about what the word Sabbath meant at the end of this chapter.
ni he kha zana mina ko hem khat to ki gen ta wa he sabat ki chi bang gen na he chi kha
So I want to address that here so you understand the fullness of what this chapter is saying.
hoi ta ke se kha ka gen chen na kha ome se ka ya bung pum pi na atuk pen kha ni se ki na
Verse 4, he's speaking about God's creation in 7 days, and he rested on the seventh day.
he chang li na kha pa the ni na ni sa gi sung a thil siam na thu a ni sa gi a hol na thu gen ma sa a
And he says, they will not enter into my rest.
hoi ka hol na alut ke hial ding chi mo kai
That's the rest at the end of creation rest.
hoi hol na chi pen kha pa thian thil siam te a hol na
That's
to
the,
pen hi a
that's the true promised land, not the promised land in Canaan.
he hol na chi pen kha kana na hol na pen kilowina tang ton hol na pen gen hi
Verse 6, seeing therefore it remains that some should enter therein too, they to whom the good tidings were before preached failed to enter because of disobedience.
he chang guk na kha hu chin ni dang a tan chinoi zama sa te thumal lo zia kin lut ke ma leo khen khat te he hol na alut na ding wa thu chiam om lai zia kin alut lai ding om hi chi
Verse 7, he defined a certain day today, saying in David a long time afterwards, today if you hear his voice, he's still going on that definition that we talked about today.
tu nia again kha chang sa gi na na davita ama ki gen sa bang ina in bang ni bang e bangin bang ni yam asep tom no ni tu nia ona zak cheng na long tang khap sak keu na chi he
Now, verse 8, he's going to shift from today between salvation and the promised land, and he's going to talk about another day.
Hujana Changet Nana Tuni Tilo Nidang Kat Munggen Tahi.
Verse 8, if Joshua had given them rest, he would not have spoken afterwards of another day.
Hoja kaya Joshua na mau te call sakna anapia itale nituam dang again kay di nga natsitahe.
Today is when we're walking.
Tuni chika e kahitya ipai te na hungen na hiya.
Today is when we can obey.
Tuni chi pen kha athui man the hun lai gen na hiya.
There will come another day, and it's the day after today.
Ni khat hongom non ding a wai kha tuni khit chang hongom di pen hiya.
It's tomorrow.
Wai kha jing chiang ai.
It's the day of rest.
Wai cho to dam na ni yong itadi ngai.
So, as we start talking about this, remember that the book of Hebrews is a book about the old law was a shadow of good things to come.
Hebrew pumpi sim chagina he kha dan lui te pen kha dan thaka dia ali mahi dan hong la kahi.
Chapter 10, verse 1 tells you that.
Bungsom changkat na hoyang gen chiang ai.
All these sacrifices, the arrangement of the temple, the tabernacle, all of this is all but a shadow of what's real.
Thukun le ke thoi na ting ting hu chabang ting ting kha atak taka hong tung ding thil et sak na le hi da ke ne.
Brothers, the exit from Egypt and the domain of the one who ruled the world through water is a shadow of what's real.
Hoi jaka ai gupta gam sala ke pan suak ta wai tui pi kan hit a omda te pen kha tuai hot dam na et sak na he.
And another shadow of what's real is them coming out of the wilderness and the barren land and crossing water to come into the promised land when Joshua takes them in.
Arbon et sak na dang kat kha wai gam da ya hong pai wa Joshua ma kai na to wai gam chiam hong pai na putung to no kha en le isil ding tam pi hong ge nei.
Those are shadows of baptism getting us out of the world and into a promised land.
Hoi kha ite na baptisma itanga kha wai tui pi kan khin hi a hoi ke pan kha I hot dam na le wai gam chiam tun ka e pai di da hong ge ta hi.
They are shadows of salvation being provided, but we still have to walk.
Hoi kha ite hot dama om khin sa hi tama le kha e pai lai ding hi chi kha ge nei.
So this language here in chapter 3, verse 8, if Joshua had given them rest, he would not have spoken afterwards of another day. Did Joshua give them rest?
Hoi kha bung li nai na again pen kha Joshua ina wai khol na pe thei le khol na dang gen lo di chi hi.
Look at Deuteronomy chapter 12.
Deuteronomy som ni na kha ngai.
Before we do that, what is your answer? Did Joshua give them rest when he took them into the physical promised land?
Ya kha Joshua ina wai gam cham kha khol na pia. At least he'll observe a Sabbath rest. At least Joshua will observe that Sabbath rest. Weekly rest.
There will be Sabbath days each week that are observed, yes.
Wai kha Sabbath ni pen bel kha om den de ma hi.
But when Joshua took them into the promised land across the Jordan, did they reach the rest that was promised to them?
Ai le wai Joshua in kha promised land wai gam chiam atunwa kha wai khol na mu taw ya. The answer can be yes or no, isn't it?
The answer can be yes or no.
Khol na tak tak apia na kaya Joshua na pia hi mya le.
Benson said yes. They achieved rest in the shadow.
Una pa Benson again pen kamo khol na bel muai le khol na pen ka alim le hi se dong le.
Did they achieve the promised ultimate rest that God had told them they would get?
Hele pa kene na toldam na nanung pen achi pen kha hidiam.
Moses tells them they're not there yet.
Mosin kha wai tan tung nai lo hi chidat et chi hi.
Look at Deuteronomy chapter 12.
Deuteronomy 12 ina hichebang ina again hi.
Remember where Moses is giving this address in when he's speaking in Deuteronomy.
Deuteronomy ya Mosin again chang bang gen na yam.
Chapter 9, verse 1, Hear, O Israel, you are about to pass over the Jordan this day to go in to dispossess the nations greater and mightier than yourself.
Chapter 9 verse.
Chapter 9, verse 1.
Chapter 9 verse 1 ang kadito ron mi. Israel mi teo ngai khiaun no sana thupi zo le thili thei zo namte khopi van suna kul dai kak le thupi lwa dingin tunin Jordan gal ka a nakwan ding wa hi.
When we get to chapter 12, they are standing at the Jordan, ready to just go in.
He bung som lani na kha amaw kha Jordan gal kai na alut mai ding a om layo na.
Now look at chapter 12. They are still there when Moses says this.
He bung som lani na kha wai mu na amaw ding layo chu.
He says, verse 8, you are not to do after all the things that we do here this day, whatsoever is right in your own eyes.
Changgen na mi chin amaw hoi sak bang chiat a tunia na hi bangwa na hi dingu a hi kei.
So he says, you're not going to keep doing what you want when you get over the river.
Hoi tui piga na kai cha no dan no mo ki di hoi kei.
When you get over there in what we're calling the rest or the promised land, you still have to do some things. You have to do them better than you were doing them the day before.
Hun pai sa na hi sangwa khawai sung na lu cha ha nei diu tam zo hi thil hoi nei diu tam zo hi.
And in verse 9, he tells them why.
Chang ko na ka bang ziak chi hong gen ta.
Why are they not to just do whatever they want after they cross over the River Jordan?
Hoi Jordan na kan gi chang auru to bol thei lo de hi na je ku khang gen ta hi chang ko na kha.
I mean, they've gone into the rest at that point, right?
Hoi ka ma kha to khol a khol na mun diu bel tung ta hi ma lo mo.
They've gone into the promised land.
A promise land tung ta u chu mo.
In a sense, in a shadow.
Hi chena alim lak ta hi chu mo ali ma chu tung ta u chu.
But look at verse 9. You are not yet come to the rest and to the inheritance which Jehovah your God gives you.
Ile chang ko na kha mo tung nai lo chi chu to pa na pa thian un no hon piak gam le khol na la na tung nai ta di ngal ke wa chi lai lai.
Do you see that at the very edge of the Jordan, right when they are ready to go in, Moses says, this is not the real rest.
Moses na wai Jordan agal kai khit nu le he kha khol na tak tak de hinai lo hi ana chi he.
You still have to walk in faith and obedience after this.
Hoi kita khano ken kha gin na to na pai lai bi hi chi na he.
Because your job is not done
Na na se ko zo nai lo he.
to walk in Him.
Ama na pai lai diu ama tung to na pai lai diu.
Because there still remains another day of rest after this.
Azia kha hiai ban na le kha hun dang khat khol na ni om lai ding hi khol na hun om lai ding hi.
And Moses actually says this is not your real inheritance.
Hoi ban Moses again che kha gam chem na lo di penu tak tak ya hinai lo hi chi un na hi da.
And our Hebrew writer over in chapter 9 in verse 15 will talk about the promise of an eternal inheritance.
Hebrew na bungkwan na kha tang ton go lo ding thuang gen ta ding hi.
That eternal inheritance is the other day, is the tomorrow, is the real rest.
Hoi tang ton go lo ding chi pen kha tol dam na tak tak gam chem tak tak pen tang ton tol dam na hong ta ding hi.
So when we look at verse 8 of chapter 4, if Joshua had given them rest, he would not have spoken afterwards of another day.
Hoi ja ka bung li chang gen na kha Joshua khol na hon pe ta le khol ni tuam nang gen lo ding chi hi.
If Joshua had given them rest, Moses, God, would not have spoken of another day after what we call today.
Joshua na tol dam na ana pe thei ta le kha mo. He Moses na again pen tol dam na pe thei le kha tol dam na hun dang khol na tu dang gen lo ding ai chu.
Verse 11, let us therefore give diligence to enter into that rest, not the shadow, the real one.
Chang som le khat na kha kwa man wai thu man lo na banga o ma ipuk lo na demun wai khol na lu ding in phatol ngai ding mon chi khol na lu nai lo pan chi ai.
Do you see what he's doing in this chapter?
Hei bunga pathian na thil hi imu ya
today for the rest of our lives while we can respond in faith and obedience. That is today.
Ginale ituman te hun lai pe na kha tuni hun hiya.
That is the day that we have to walk because we are between salvation and the real rest tomorrow.
Hoi tuni achi hun sung kha hot dam na le he khol na tak tak ke kal thu ge na hi.
And if you stop walking in faith and therefore are disobedient, you are saying, is Jehovah even among us? He hasn't completed his works yet.
Hoi gin na le thuman na tung to na ipai ke le chu ta thian la ka om ke chi na to ke bang ding ai.
But he has, we're just not there. He has completed the work, we're just not there yet.
Pa thian na ana teng sem khin tai le a khol na tung ngai lo chi thu he.
Where is the rest?
Hoi khol na pen koi takai ta di le.
Jesus will give us rest, right?
Jesun tol dam na ham pe di mo le.
Matthew 11:28 and 29.
Matthew som le kha chang som ni le kwa na kha chang som ni le ge som ni le kwa na.
2 Thessalonians 1:7 through 9, there will be rest.
2 Thessalonians chapter
1:7 through 9. I'm not turning
le
there
bung
because
kha chang sak ya pan chang kwa.
I only have 2 minutes to sum up. Here's the message of chapter 3.
Hiai bung thum na thu khayai tai.
The Israelites that exited Egypt wanted to be done right then.
Israel te kha wa Egypt a ke panong pot khia wa kha ahunta le chi kha de a hiu.
And the Hebrew writer is weaving these words about today and another day and rest to say, your job is not done.
Wa je Hebrew la gel tu na game pen kha no ten na sep du zo nai lo na hiu hi a chi nai.
What was the problem with the Israelites? They wanted to quit right after he finished his work.
Israel te pendel pa khelena hot dam na amao de apia khit nung ina tol dam u ta hiu kholu ta hiu.
But in Exodus 14:14, he had said, you walk.
Le Exodus bung som le chang som le na kha pai zum zelum chi ai.
They're not doing the work, but they still have to do the walk.
Amao ten kha apai na diu kha ai abol lai diu he.
And the Hebrew writer's message is, God, chapter 1, came, chapter 2, and did everything, but you have to walk, chapter
Wa ja
3.
ka bung khat na pathian hi na ne pathian ng kha le tu ma bung ni na hong pa ya bung thum na kha no le na pai zom zel diu chi he.
Now take everything that I told you about verses 12 through 16 yesterday and about how magnificent that is, and put that at the end of this message.
Ma ja ka jana bung ni na chang som le gu ka ke pan ka gen te pen kha to thu top nai na koi leo chen ka de he.
Because of who he is and the message that he's given us, because of what he's done, you walk because he's on the throne.
Ama kwa hi chi kha the Jesu pen no ama kwa hi chi the chen la abana aman kha ya de bang na hong sep sakhiam chi the la hoi te na the siam chiang una no le payun chi he.
And he sees you, and he's walked that walk, and he knows everything about you.
Aman no te hon mua ama te khawai ama hwailam pian na pai sai changa kha aman kha hong pan pi the hi.
And that could be scary to us because I'm not worthy.
Ina dia kha atak lo hi na kha ala uai dan na kilang mai the.
But because of what he's done for us, chapter 2, to become a merciful and faithful high priest, it's not frightening.
Hili ama kha zakai na dim siam pulian hi na ia dia la hoi lo hi.
It's glorious hope if all I do is simply draw near to him, hold fast with boldness.
Ia dia nga I thi ong sun chu hoi zakai na tut pha pen kha lao lo ina zakai na tut pha lam kha imano dinga huchina len kip igin na pen len kip di mai.
But I have to draw near to him and I have to walk towards him if I am to receive mercy and grace to help in a time of need. Verse 16.
Pada chan som le gung again pen kha ama ke pan pi na ama ke pan za ngai na he pi na ha na ding na ama kyang imano a ama kyang ke pai ding a he.
I am 1 minute over, and that is as close to on time as I have ever finished.
Minute katinak ini kasi kai katahin.
Because I taught some of that yesterday.
Thank you so much.